There was once a man who lived a life so ordinary that most people never noticed him at all. He walked through the same crowded streets every day, yet always felt invisible, like a shadow drifting among brighter lives. His apartment was small, dimly lit, filled with the silence of years. On the walls, old photographs hung, whispering of better times that had long since slipped away. His days were heavy with repetition. Wake, work, return, sleep. No laughter, no warmth, only the slow erosion of time pressing upon him. At work, his desk was cluttered with papers he never cared to read. At night, he would sit by the window, staring at the lights of the city, wondering if life had forgotten him. He rarely smiled. His heart carried regrets he never shared. If you looked at him, you would think he was simply tired. But the truth was heavier. He was a man who had stopped believing that change was possible. One evening, after another long day of silence, he switched off the light and lay down on his bed. He closed his eyes, not knowing that the sleep awaiting him would not be like any other. That night, something would come to him, something that would change the course of his entire life. In his sleep, he opened his eyes to find himself standing in the middle of a vast desert. Golden sand stretched endlessly in every direction, while above him the sky burned in shades of crimson and deep amber, as if painted by an unseen hand. The air was still, and yet, from the silence, he could hear faint whispers, soft, unrecognizable voices that seemed to rise from the earth itself. He began to walk. Each step felt heavy, as though the desert were testing his will. His feet sank into the sand, and the horizon appeared impossibly far away. But then, in the distance, a small glimmer caught his eye, a fragile light, faint, trembling, yet impossible to ignore. He moved toward it slowly, drawn by a pull he could not explain. As he approached, the light grew clearer until he saw what it was, a lantern held in the hands of a small child. The boy stood silently, his face calm, his eyes deeper than the night sky. He said no words. He only looked at the man, and somehow that gaze carried more meaning than language ever could. The man followed. Each step after the child felt lighter than the one before, as if the desert itself wanted him to continue. With every stride, the sand beneath his feet began to glow softly, marking a path towards something unknown. And then, at last, they arrived. An oasis, alive with shimmering water and trees that swayed though no wind blew. The voices returned, clearer now, echoing through the still air. Forgive, let go, change your life. The man knelt beside the water and reached out. His reflection stared back at him, but it was not the reflection he knew. Gone was the face weighed down by bitterness and regret. In its place was a version of himself he had forgotten long ago, a face that still carried hope. For the first time in years, a smile touched his lips. It was small, fragile, but it was real. And as he smiled, the desert around him began to transform. The dry sand shifted into fields of green. Flowers bloomed where there had been only emptiness. Birds filled the air with song, and the horizon stretched wide with new life. The child still stood there, holding the lantern. But slowly, his figure began to fade, dissolving into the light. The lantern floated upward on its own, glowing brighter and brighter until the man was surrounded by pure radiance. He felt warmth spread through his chest. He felt the weight he had carried for so long begin to melt away. It was then he understood. This was not just a dream. It was a message. Change does not come from the world outside. It begins within. He opened his eyes suddenly, gasping as though he had returned from another world. The same small room surrounded him, but it was no longer the same. Through the window, morning light poured in, soft and golden, painting the walls with warmth. For the first time, he saw beauty in a place he had once despised. He rose from his bed slowly, with a quiet determination. He dressed, but this time with a gentle smile on his face. Stepping outside, the city seemed alive in a way it never had before. The streets were the same, the people were the same, but he was no longer the same. He noticed a child waiting nervously at the edge of the road. Without hesitation, he took the boy's hand and guided him safely across. He saw a homeless man sitting on the corner, and he offered him food. Passing his neighbor, a man he had ignored for years, he greeted him with laughter. Later, he wrote a letter of apology to someone he had wronged and placed it carefully in the post. In the afternoon, he sat on a wooden bench in the park, listening to the rustle of the trees. He took a deep breath, and for the first time, it felt like he was truly breathing. Looking up at the sky, his eyes shimmered with a light no one had ever seen in him before. He was no longer a man broken by the weight of life. He was a man reborn, changed forever by a dream that had reminded him of what he could become. As the days unfolded, the man discovered that change was not a single moment, but a journey that kept unfolding before him. Each morning when he opened his eyes, he felt as though the dream still whispered to him, urging him forward. The kindness he had once offered timidly became a habit, then a rhythm, and finally the very fabric of his existence. But with change came new challenges. Not everyone welcomed his transformation. Some who had known him before looked at him with suspicion, whispering behind his back, "How can a man change so suddenly? Surely it cannot last." Others tried to test his patience, mocking his newfound calm. Yet, instead of anger, he offered them silence. Instead of resentment, he offered them kindness. And little by little, even the skeptics found themselves disarmed. One evening, as he walked home beneath a sky brushed with silver moonlight, he passed an old church that had long been abandoned. Its wooden doors sagged, its windows broken, yet something drew him inside. Within the ruins, he found carvings on the wall, half erased by time, yet still legible. "Light is not what you see, it is what you give." He sat in the silence of that place for hours, the words echoing through him. They were not so different from the dream, and he wondered if perhaps life itself was filled with lanterns, waiting for those who dared to notice them. Seasons changed. Winter draped the city in silence. Spring returned with blossoms, and summer filled the streets with laughter. With each season, he grew not younger, but lighter. His neighbors began to look for him not just as a presence, but as a guide, a quiet strength they could lean on. The homeless man he once helped now worked in a shelter, inspired by that first gesture. The child he once guided across the street grew into a young boy who ran to him every morning, waving eagerly, calling him grandfather, though they shared no blood. And one night, years later, the dream returned. He found himself once again in the desert, though this time he was not alone. Dozens of lanterns flickered on the horizon, each held by someone he had touched with kindness. The boy with the first lantern appeared once more, smiling as he walked forward. "You see," the boy whispered at last, A dream does not end when you wake. It begins. The man woke again with tears in his eyes. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were the tears of someone who had finally understood. His life was not saved by a single dream. It was transformed because he chose to live as if the dream had never ended. Years passed, and the man's hair grew silver, but his eyes never lost the light that the dream had left inside them. People in his neighborhood began to tell stories of him, not as a legend, not as a saint, but as a man who lived differently. Some said he carried lanterns in his eyes. Others said his presence alone could calm a room. He never claimed to be anything more than what he was, a man who had once been broken and who had chosen to be whole again. One autumn evening, as leaves scattered across the streets, a stranger came to him. The young man's face was weary, his voice trembling. "I don't know how to keep living," he confessed, eyes lowered in shame. The older man looked at him and smiled softly. "You don't need to know how to live the whole of it," he said. "You only need to begin with a single step and a single dream." And in that moment, the younger man felt a spark, as though a lantern had been passed quietly from one soul to another. The years kept weaving their pattern. The city grew, generations changed, but everywhere he went, he carried that lantern within him. Not everyone understood him, but those who did carried something away with them, a piece of light they had not possessed before. He saw the child who once called him grandfather grow into a man, and that man became a father himself, telling his children stories about the old neighbor who believed in dreams. And then, one night, near the very end of his life, the dream came to him again. But this time, the desert was no longer empty. It was filled with thousands of lanterns stretching as far as the eye could see, each carried by someone whose life had been touched by kindness. Not only his, but kindness passed on from those he had inspired. The boy with the first lantern was there too, smiling as always, but now he was joined by countless others. The desert was no longer barren. It was alive with light. The man stood among them, tears in his eyes, and for the last time, he understood. Dreams do not end. Lives do not end. They continue, passed forward like lanterns, one hand to another, until the world itself becomes brighter. When the man's life finally reached its quiet close, the city mourned him not with grand monuments or elaborate words, but with silence filled with memory. Neighbors gathered at doorsteps, children whispered his name, and the boy who once called him grandfather lit a lantern at his window, keeping it burning through the night. One by one, others followed. Lanterns in windows, lanterns on porches, lanterns carried through the streets, until the entire neighborhood glowed as though the dream itself had spilled into waking life. In the years that followed, his story became more than a tale. It became a practice. People began to speak of the lantern way, a way of living marked not by wealth or power, but by kindness passed forward. A teacher carried it into her classroom, offering patience where others offered punishment. A doctor carried it into his practice, staying longer with those who had no family. A stranger carried it into a distant town, lighting lanterns for those who had never heard the man's name, yet somehow felt his presence in the warmth of others. Generations shifted and the details of his face began to fade from memory. Children no longer knew exactly where he had lived, or which bench in the park had been his favorite, yet the essence of him remained, like a fragrance in the air long after the flowers are gone. They said, "There was once a man who lived as if dreams never ended, and because of him, we carry lights." And so, in places he never walked, in lives he never touched with his own hands, the lanterns multiplied. His dream, once a private vision in the desert of his sleep, had become a river of light flowing through time. And though his name faded, the brightness remained. Perhaps that is the true secret, that no life truly ends, just as no dream truly fades. They pass onward, from one heart to another, until the whole world glows a little brighter. Centuries passed, and the lanterns became more than just symbols of remembrance. They became traditions woven into the lives of people who never knew the man, yet lived by his light. In one village, each child was given a small lantern on their first birthday, not as a gift of possession, but as a reminder. Your light belongs to the world. In another town, during the darkest nights of winter, neighbors gathered to fill the streets with lanterns, pushing back the shadows together. And in faraway places, where no trace of his name had survived, the spirit of the Lantern Way still found its home. Farmers left lanterns at the edge of their fields for travelers lost at night. Sailors lit lanterns on their ships, not just for navigation, but as a prayer for those left behind on shore. Even in bustling cities of glass and steel, where neon lights tried to outshine the stars, simple lanterns still burned in quiet windows, fragile but stubborn, like hope itself. Generations no longer told his story word for word. They did not speak of the desert dream, or the boy with the lantern, or even the man who once lived among them. Instead, they spoke in acts, in patience shown to strangers, in food offered to the hungry, in comfort given to the lonely. The story had become life itself, and perhaps that was the truest legacy. Not a memory of a man, but a way of living that outlived memory. For as long as lanterns were lit, in streets, in homes, in hearts, the dream never ended. One night, a child looked up at the sky, filled with stars, and asked her mother, "Who lit the first lantern?" The mother smiled and shook her head. "No one knows, but what matters is that we keep them burning." And so they did. The lanterns continued to glow, not for days or years, but for centuries more. They became woven into the rhythm of humanity itself, a quiet flame that never allowed the world to be entirely swallowed by darkness. Wars came and went, cities rose and fell, empires expanded and crumbled, but somewhere, always, there was a lantern burning. Scholars began to write of the Lantern Ages, periods in history where kindness seemed to flourish unexpectedly, tracing back not to rulers or kings, but to ordinary people who carried a simple light forward. Poets spoke of it as if it were starlight that had chosen to live among human beings. Musicians sang of it as an invisible thread connecting hearts across oceans. One day explorers reached distant lands where languages were unfamiliar, where no tale of the man or the dream remained, and yet they found lanterns waiting for them. In mountain villages, children lit lanterns on the longest night of the year. On islands far across the sea, fishermen left lanterns on the shore for safe return. In the deserts, travelers carried lanterns not only to see but to guide one another. The story had dissolved into life so completely that no one could say where it began. And then, in an age of machines and light brighter than the sun, people still lit lanterns. In glass towers, in crowded alleys, in quiet corners of forgotten towns, fragile flames glowed as if to remind the world, we are not machines, we are keepers of light. Perhaps in the end, the greatest miracle was not the dream itself, nor the man who first carried its flame, but the truth it revealed, that every life, no matter how ordinary, can pass forward a spark, and as long as sparks are shared, the darkness never wins. And so, beneath the endless stars, the lanterns burned, not as memory, not as myth, but as the heartbeat of a world that had learned at last to carry its light together. The stars wheeled on, centuries folding into millennia, and still the lanterns glowed. They no longer belonged to one people or one place, but to all of humanity. Children were born into a world where the lantern light was as natural as sunrise, as expected as the beating of a heart. Few remembered when the first lantern was lit, and fewer still remembered the man whose dream had begun it. But none questioned its presence, for the lanterns had become a language beyond words, a fire passed hand to hand, age to age. As civilizations rose into the skies, building towers that brushed the clouds, and as others dug deep beneath the earth to carve new worlds, the lanterns followed. Some burned as symbols in vast halls where nations met to decide their future. Others flickered quietly in the hands of wanderers, guiding them through unknown paths. Some were carried into space itself, glowing softly inside the windows of ships drifting among the stars, a reminder that wherever humanity went, it would not journey in darkness. In time, scholars began to speak not of history divided into kingdoms or empires, but of the era of lanterns, an era defined not by conquest, but by continuity, not by rulers, but by resilience. And poets whispered of something even greater, that perhaps the lanterns were not only symbols of humanity, but of something eternal, something the universe itself had planted in human hands, the power to share light. And so, long after names were lost, long after cities had changed, long after memories had turned to dust, the lanterns burned, not as memory, not even as tradition, but as a truth older than time, that every spark passed forward is a victory over the dark. Perhaps one day, when the last star has burned itself out, there will still be a lantern, fragile, flickering, stubborn, carried in the hands of whoever remains, proof that humanity once lived and once chose light. When the last star finally fell silent and the universe lay in vast oceans of shadow, there was still a light. Fragile, yes, but alive. The lantern glowed not only as proof of humanity, but as a seed of something greater. It was carried across the endless dark by hands unseen, as though the cosmos itself had chosen to keep it safe. In the silence of eternity, the lantern's flame began to do what all light does. It reached outward. From that single flicker, threads of brilliance unfurled across the void, weaving constellations where no stars remained. Slowly, patiently, the darkness itself was painted with echoes of light until the emptiness was no longer empty. Eras beyond measure passed, and from those threads, new worlds were born. Planets coalesced, oceans shimmered, skies opened. Life stirred again, drawn instinctively toward the lantern's glow. On these newborn shores, creatures lifted their eyes to the flame that hovered above them and felt, without knowing why, The pull of kindness, the rhythm of sharing, the truth of carrying light forward. They did not know humanity's name. They did not dream the same desert dream, but they inherited what remained, the lantern way, not as a story, not even as memory, but as the architecture of life itself. And so the flame continued, no longer bound to one species or one age. It became the universe's quiet covenant that wherever life awakens, it awakens with light in its hands. As ages beyond comprehension unfolded, the lantern was no longer seen as an object, nor even as a flame. It became a law of being, woven into the heartbeat of creation. Wherever life stirred, it carried with it not just the spark of survival, but the quiet instinct to share. Civilizations rose under suns alien and strange, their forms unrecognizable to the ancient eyes of humanity. Yet all of them, in their own way, lifted lanterns to the dark. On a world of crystal mountains, beings of light gathered to exchange glowing shards, each fragment a gift that shimmered brighter when passed to another. On a sea world of endless waves, creatures sang across the waters, their voices carrying luminous orbs that drifted like floating lanterns from shore to shore. In a sky world of endless storms, winged forms traced paths of light through thunderclouds, leaving behind trails that guided the lost to safety. They had no name for the man who dreamed. They knew nothing of his desert, nor the boy who carried the first lantern. Yet they lived by his inheritance, as naturally as breathing. The flame had become the covenant of life itself, and in the deepest silence between galaxies where no suns had yet been born, the flame waited still, not demanding, not fading, but patient, as though it knew that wherever the cosmos grew dark, another hand of whatever form would reach out and carry it forward. Perhaps that was the final truth. Not that humanity created the light, but that they revealed it. For the lantern had never belonged to one people, one world, or one age. It had always been there, waiting for someone to notice, someone to share, someone to carry it into eternity. And so, as the universe expanded, filled with lives uncounted and stories untold, the lantern burned on, not fragile anymore but infinite, not a seed but a star reborn. The star that had been the lantern did not shine like others. Its light was softer, warmer, as though every spark of kindness that had ever been shared across worlds had gathered inside it. Unlike ordinary suns that blazed and burned until they collapsed, this star pulsed like a heartbeat, steady, eternal, unyielding. Beings across countless galaxies lifted their eyes toward it, not knowing its origin, yet feeling its call deep within them. Travelers crossing interstellar voids used its glow as their compass, for its light never dimmed. Poets of alien worlds spoke of it as the first flame, and priests in temples built under strange skies bowed toward it in silence. Children born under distant suns traced its glow in their skies and asked their elders what it was. No one could say for certain. Some called it the eternal lantern, others named it the covenant star. But all agreed it was proof that light, once shared, could never be undone. And as civilizations rose and fell, some vanishing without a trace, the star remained. It was there long after names were lost, long after languages faded, long after memory itself had dissolved. And still, whenever life awakened, the instinct remained to pass light forward, to carry the spark, to keep the flame alive.